In recent times, the central bank has been doing a lot to improve the access of Bahamians and non-Bahamians to our banking system in terms of how they go about opening up accounts for deposits and other activities. And this is part of our broader initiative on financial inclusion, providing persons with access to the regulated products and services that are available in our financial system. And for us, financial inclusion is important in and of itself in giving persons such access, but it is also about building up the defenses that we have in our country against criminal abuses, money laundering, corruption, and the like. And part of that is positioning individuals where they can make use of electronic means of conducting financial transactions, means that are traceable. By definition, they're not based on cash, and by definition, they help to put a country in a better position, both in terms of how it looks at itself, as well as how it's viewed from abroad in terms of how vulnerable a country is to money laundering and criminal activities, and how easy or how equipped a country is to monitor financial transactions and to be able to detect when criminal activities are happening through the financial system. And so that really is driving our initiative to promote financial inclusion. And once we are in that position, there are spin-off benefits in the country, in the sense that to the extent that it provides better information about what's going on, it provides data that we can share with our investor population so that they can have a better feel for what's going on. It also means, if we do it right, that we're equipping our commercial enterprises, our businesses, to be able also to function better in the digital economy and to reduce their exposure to handling large amounts of cash. When banks open accounts for individuals, by law and regulations, they are required to have reliable information to identify who the customer is, and also to determine whether the kinds of transactions that the customer will be doing pose any risk to the institution or of a criminal or undesirable nature. What we are saying is that on a risk basis, the majority of the individuals who interact with financial institutions do not pose significant risk of a money laundering or other nature. And so we want to make certain that we're able to get them into the door of the banks without necessarily encountering the difficulties that may be posed, say, by high-risk persons entering the banking system. In most cases where the institutions are able to determine that the risk posed from the customer, or the risk posed by the customers, is not unmanageable, or it's not a high-risk situation, what we're saying is that once you've satisfied yourself that you've identified the individual, you know how to contact the individual reliably, that is sufficient basis on which you should be able to give them a bank account. We look at it in terms of the kinds of documents that may be government issued that a person can use to identify themselves. In most cases, these are government issued photo identification. In the case of the government issued ID, these are typically identification documents that have a photo on them, and they provide sufficient information to identify who you are and give your date of birth. And in the case of the Bahamian documents, they typically also provide information about your national insurance number. So in the Bahamian case, the primary document is the passport. If you're a Bahamian going into a bank and opening up an account, what we're saying is that if you present your passport, that is sufficient means of identifying yourself. That's what we consider a Category A document. Now, there are some other Category A documents which, if you're using those, you have to present two pieces of documents, say a national insurance card, a national identity card, if you're coming from another country, a work permit, a Bahamas government work permit, because those are also photo IDs, a spousal permit, which can also have a photograph on it, and there are some other documents that fit into the category that we would consider government-issued identification from a photo basis that you can use to establish a relationship. And then we have what we call the Category B document. And in this case, you're moving away from photo ID. And in the case of the Bahamas, a Category B document would be a birth certificate. Moving beyond the birth certificate, we have Category C documents. And Category C documents basically assume that the individual doesn't have sufficient documentation independently to identify themselves, but they're relying on secondary sources. In most cases, secondary sources that the bank has familiarity with. So an example would be you present an identification card from your place of work. You have a reference letter from somebody in the community who knows you well. And the expectation is not that individuals who show up at a financial institution who have photo ID, where they just maybe need to just go away and come back a few minutes or a day later and produce it. The Category C and B list is not for their convenience. It's for the convenience of those who legitimately don't have the photo IDs, and that should not be the general case. These are exceptions. In identification of individuals for account opening purposes, it is not an exercise in determining whether the individual has a right to work in the Bahamas or has a work permit. So even in those cases when they are presenting the work permit to identify themselves, we're not saying, and this is an exchange control policy change, we're not saying that they must produce evidence of the work permit or that the bank must check for the existence of the work permit to open the account. That is not a requirement. What we're saying is that the banks must be able to determine whether you are a resident or a non-resident. If the bank determines that you're a non-resident and the account, it is determined that the account is not going to be a high value, high volume account for transaction purposes, then they do not have to rely on exchange control approvals to open the account. And the threshold here is $50,000. So any facility where the account holder intends to accumulate more than $50,000 in balances, that is the facility which at the time of opening, if they disclose it, or if at any time during the relationship it's determined that that's the case, that is the facility where the exchange control approval would have to be gotten. So that is very important. And again, the stress here is on financial inclusion and participation in the regulated system, understanding that not every non-resident who decides to open up a Bahamian dollar account will have a work permit. We're also recognizing that if such persons are in our midst now and they are gainfully involved in economic activities, they are earning income and they are remitting. So bringing them into the formal financial system benefits us because now we have a better view of the transactions that they're undertaking, and we're reducing the risk of criminal infiltration that happens when you have accumulation of cash in various pockets and communities in our country. So that's very important, and we're trying to tackle that separate and apart from any of the other issues that might be involved with residence and non-residency. So one of the questions that comes up from time to time is, has the central bank lowered the standards necessary for persons to establish a bank account? And the answer is no. We've just provided more clarity around the process. And what we're trying to stress is that there are two parts to the relationship that banks establish with customers. One is that the banks determine the identity of the individuals, they determine the risk profile of the account, and then they determine whether, given the risk profile, it's acceptable to establish a relationship. The next is banks are required by law to monitor the account to be able to detect when illegal activities are happening over the account. So the account monitoring stage is extremely important, and the obligations of financial institutions are not diminished as regards to how they are supposed to be monitoring the account for suspicious activities that might point to money laundering, corruption, or other criminal activities. In the modern age of financial services and products, there are means such as email, text messaging, and the traditional residential address that are all just as valid to enable persons to establish accounts. As a matter of fact, the guidance now requires that the institutions rely on at least two reliable means of contacting the customer. And so that moves it just from beyond the postal address to recognizing all the other means in which we communicate and contact each other in present times. In a lot of cases where you're looking at the private banking environment, where you're dealing with high net worth individuals, financial institutions will, in many cases, apply much more rigor beyond just the identification process. The reason why we're doing this is to provide guidance on the means by which persons can identify themselves in general for doing transactions with financial institutions. You know, whether you're doing a power of attorney and you have to provide the bank with comfort around who you are, whether you're going to the bank to cash a check or to make a deposit or to transfer money abroad. And identification, when paired with some of the other supporting information the person provides when they establish relationship with banks, we're trying to simplify it so that from an international perspective, we can be more effective in terms of how we monitor our account for transaction purposes, that we can demonstrate, for example, that our financial institutions not only know how to identify you, but they know how to reach you when they need to reach you. And that's very important in terms of us being able to see how we compare against other countries and jurisdictions where we are being held to very high standards in terms of to know your customer relationships, and higher than just the monitoring side of the account, but also in terms of how we're able to follow up and interact with customers when it is necessary. I would just encourage those who want to get more information and details on what we've done to go to the central bank's website and to read the documents in detail if they so desire, and to, in doing so, get a general appreciation of the broad objectives behind this process and how it possibly affects them.